Well, thank you for the introduction, Mary, and thank you to the Steamboat Institute for having me here this weekend. It's truly a pleasure and a privilege to be here and meeting so many of you this weekend thus far. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to October 7th, give an update on the military situation, go into Israel's domestic considerations, and then expand outward about the other regional threats that Israel faces. But first, I grew up in Chicago, and after college, I voluntarily enlisted in the Israel Defense Forces. And even though I have a healthy fear of heights and no rational desire to jump out of a perfectly good airplane, I volunteered to try out for the paratroopers where I served during my service. I was proud to defend Israel, the Jewish people, and frankly, the West against the same evil forces that continue to target the Jewish state and really the United States today. And then as senior advisor to 2 Israeli ambassadors, I was again on the front lines trying to make Israel's case before that paragon of virtue and decency and truth, the United Nations. And truth be told, between the IDF and the UN, I'm not really sure which job was harder. Though it's been a few years since I've been in uniform or in the United Nations, I'm still certainly doing my part to help fight for Israel, and I've been fortunate enough to speak before a variety of audiences, organizations, the media, et cetera, because I want to ensure that everyone appreciates what's at stake in this war in Israel right now. And for the men and women currently serving on Israel's front lines, both in the battlefield and the diplomatic arena, they certainly know what's at stake. And they know that, frankly, failure is not an option. Today is day 106. 106 days since Hamas terrorists came over the border into Israel and slaughtered 1,200 Israelis and some Americans. 106 days, maybe a little dry here. 106 days since 242 civilians were abducted back into Gaza. 106 days since 136 of those civilians have seen the sun. To put in perspective as well, another way of looking at it is 106 days is more than 1/4 of the entire lifespan of the youngest hostage. Kfir Bibas was born 9 months before he was abducted, and on Thursday, he celebrated his first birthday in Hamas captivity. While the calendar today may read January 20th, 2024, for Israel and many of us in the Jewish community, it's still October 7th, 2023. We are in a new era. And I think this has become increasingly clear to many Americans across the country. Certainly it is to all of you. That's why you're here this weekend. But it's also been very clear to Israelis for some time. It was thought that October 7th occurred simply because of the outgrowth, perhaps, of regional power play dynamics. That Iran, in particular, feeling threatened by the Abraham Accords between Israel and Sunni Arab states in the Gulf, and potential normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, sought to drive a wedge between those two countries. And what better way to divide Arabs from Jews than to put Arabs and Jews in a situation where they're fighting each other? But now it may be that October 7th occurred for a far simpler reason and predated the last few years. It came to light about 10 days or 2 weeks ago that Hamas, 5 leaders in particular, had devised Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, which is a name for the October 7th attack, about 10 years ago. Back then in 2014, they devised a plan to send about 70 of their top terrorists across the border to kill and abduct Israeli soldiers and potentially civilians, to bring them back into Gaza. Now, they probably thought of this plan because in 2011, Israel had conducted the largest hostage for prisoner exchange in its history, when it traded 1,027 Hamas terrorists, or rather convicted Palestinian terrorists, for 1 Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit. Again, 1,027 for 1. At the time, I was serving in uniform. I remember thinking, well, this engendered a lot of discussion in our units, thinking this is what Israel's going to do to return its soldiers. And frankly, if Hamas values 1 Jewish life to that much, who am I to say otherwise? And of course, one of those terrorists that Israel exchanged for was Yahya Sinwar, who is the current leader of Hamas in Gaza. Sinwar wasn't sitting in an Israeli prison for killing Israelis or Jews. He was there because he was killing Palestinians. And moreover, while he was there, he was treated for brain surgery, brain cancer, by an Israeli surgeon. Yet he devised that plan, and it was put on the shelf actually in 2014 because it was an operation between Israel and Hamas, Operation Protective Edge. It was taken off the shelf a few years ago to be planned and trained for, and it was implemented 106 days ago. Now, in response to the attack, what did Israelis feel? Not only to the horror and shock of that day's attack, but they felt an historic sense of vulnerability. That an enemy they thought they knew in Hamas in Gaza, they realized they did not know anything that from a security situation, they were completely wrong about Hamas. And they thought for the last couple of years, Hamas had been quiet. They'd been isolated, maybe even defanged to an extent, because it's been quiet since Operation Guardian of the Walls, in May 2021. That Israel's main security concern the last year was in Jenin in the West Bank. And moreover, Israel had been issuing more work visas to Gazans to come into Israel to work. But yet, they still came and slaughtered us in our homes, despite the quiet. If we were wrong about Hamas in Gaza, how wrong are we about Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon, an organization far more capable than Hamas? And what are we missing about Iran's effort to establish an IRGC base in Syria in northeastern part of Israel? And what about Hamas and Islamic Jihad cells in the West Bank? Will they suddenly rise up and kill Jews living in Judea and Samaria? Israel is suddenly realizing we are facing a potential multi-front war against enemies we might not actually understand or appreciate the depths they will go to strike at us. So with that, Israel conducts the war we're in right now. And the war has two primary stated objectives. One is to eliminate Hamas, both removing it as a governing force in Gaza, and two is to remove it as a security threat to Israel. And secondly, Israel needs to return the hostages back to Israel. But of course, there's, I believe, two unstated objectives that are equally, if not more so, important. The first is to have secure borders. In 2000, Israel pulled out of southern Lebanon, Hezbollah came in and filled the vacuum, and Israel got rocket fire, terror attacks, and the Second Lebanon War in 2006. In 2005, Israel pulled unilaterally, disengaged from Gaza. Hamas, after defeating Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in a brutal civil war, moved in, conquered Gaza Strip, and Israel got rocket attacks, rocket fire, terror attacks, and 4 operations, and now a 5th, a war. And Israelis need secure borders above all else. And secondly, in this war, Israel needs to reestablish military deterrence, to have strength. In the Middle East, power begets peace. The Abraham Accords, a key predicate of that agreement, was that Israeli power, the IDF in particular, could help these Sunni Arab countries against the Iranian threat that was threatening them directly and the region more broadly. But if Hamas, a capable but small military terrorist organization, can bleed the IDF and can make Israel seem weak and vulnerable, then what good is Israel for the Abraham Accords countries? What good are they for the Saudis? So very quickly for Israel and Israelis, this became a war about its place in the Middle East and its survival in the region. Now, we are, like I said, 106 days into this war, and thus far, on the military front, the campaign is going very well for the IDF. At first, when they entered Gaza, they went to the northern part of the Strip, around Gaza City. That's where Hamas's command and control center, primary one, was in the passive voice. It was held there. And they've essentially consolidated control over the northern third of the Strip. They're moving south now towards the Egyptian border, advancing on another city called Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is the second largest city in Gaza. It's important also because that's where Sinwar was born. That's where he's believed to be hiding in the tunnels underneath the city, very likely surrounded by some of those hostages as human shields. The IDF sent in 4 divisions and they've actually just taken 1 off the front lines to go back home for some R&R, to literally rejoin the economy, get back to their 9-to-5 jobs because they're reservists, and also with orders most likely to return in a few weeks or a few months. The question is, to the south or to the north? And as Israel focuses more on the south right now, it's shifting its operational tempo from a highly kinetic intensity operation more towards a low intensity, essentially a counterinsurgency or coin operation. This will likely continue throughout 2024, for many months into this year. But as they're focusing on Khan Yunis, also in central Gaza, they're uncovering terror tunnels, I'll get into a little bit, but all this infrastructure, and obviously looking for the hostages, and the hostages need to be returned home. Now, not lost in this is the fact that 200,000 Israelis remain displaced from their homes, primarily in the south, a lot of the areas a closed military zone, but also the north. I'll get to Hezbollah in a little bit. But 200,000 Israelis, of which about half, I think, the government is paying to stay in hotels. And that's no small hotel bill for a country the size of Israel. Now, a few elements I want to focus on in this war is rockets, tunnels, and civilian casualties. We need to understand as well that Hamas has spent the better part of 2 decades constructing the perfect urban battlefield, for them at least, embedding themselves within civilian populations, surrounding themselves by human shields, digging expansive networks of tunnels underneath the entirety of the Gaza Strip. And of course, the main, we think of Hamas's military tactics, we think of rocket fire. Rocket fire predated Hamas's control of the Gaza Strip in 2005. It's also something that Hezbollah's been doing. I'll get to them in a little bit. But Hamas has fired over 12,000 rockets in the last 100 days. They fired 4,000 of those in the first couple days alone. And then and that intensity of rocket fire was more than they fired at any time in their history in fights with Israel. 12,000 rockets is highly significant. The IDF has been systematically trying to find and destroying these rocket launching sites, and they've been doing that very effectively. It's thought that Hamas has between 30 and 40, maybe down to 20,000 rockets. The numbers obviously aren't very accurate. And of course, whenever you hear about rocket fire from Hamas, you have to think, well, they're rudimentary rockets. They mainly manufacture themselves from building supplies that they get from the international community. They manufacture them in Gaza. So they're not highly sophisticated or highly technical, or very professional for that matter. So about 10 to 20% of them fall short. So they also contribute to Palestinian civilian casualties. And the IDF has found, I just was reading this morning, rockets and weapons in every home, every UNRWA school, UN-run school, and every mosque they've come across thus far on the Gaza Strip. Now, the tunnel system. Again, part of the elaborate battlefield that Hamas has been constructing for the better part of 2 decades. It's estimated that Hamas has constructed between 350 and 450 miles of tunnels throughout the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is 25 miles north to south, and between 6 and 9 or so miles east to west. By comparison, 350 to 450 miles estimated. The New York subway system, 250 miles of tunnels. It is 400 miles from this hotel as the crow flies to the Grand Canyon. That's how much tunneling that Hamas has done, again, with materials that the international community, including the American taxpayer, has helped fund for the purpose, obviously, perhaps of building homes, hospitals, schools, et cetera. But Hamas has had one purpose in mind. It's dedicated to one proposition, that's destroying Israel and the Jewish people. And they've put, not only have they harmed and put at risk the lives of Israelis, but obviously Palestinians. Every Palestinian death that you read about, A, is a tragedy if they're civilians, because that's war, and every civilian casualty in war is unfortunate, but they are also the responsibility of Hamas. And to put some perspective on some numbers, Hamas claims that 24,000 civilians have been killed. That's their claim. You'll read it as the Ministry of Health in Gaza. It's Hamas. They say 24,000. The IDF says they've killed about 9,000 Hamas terrorists. And as an aside, that's about between 25 and 30% of their fighting force. So if we're taking Hamas at its word, 24,000 killed, and Israel says of those 24,000, 9,000 are actually Hamas terrorists. Well, the UN global average of civilian to combatant death ratio in urban combat is 9-1. Every 1 combatant killed, 9 civilians killed. In this war, with those numbers, it's 1 to 1.6. National Security Advisor John Kirby, I think last month, said that the length that the IDF is going to avert civilian casualties are lengths that even the US military would likely not go to. Nor maybe it shouldn't also. But when we think about civilian casualties in this war, it's becoming very much a political issue, particularly between the US and Israel, which I'll get to in a little bit as well. Now, Hamas has succeeded in one respect. Aside from the horrific events of the day, October 7th itself, they've succeeded in humbling Israelis. Like I said earlier, making them feel vulnerable. The Israelis realize that despite our technology, despite the Merkava tank, the F-35 strike fighter, besides the Iron Dome, and the $1 billion+ defense border, or security border that Israel established after 2014 around Gaza Strip, despite all of that, nothing beats vigilance. You must remain vigilant and be on the border with the soldier with a gun. Because as Israel knows and learned in a horrific way 106 days ago, Israel's enemies never sleep. Every year during the Passover Seder, we say, Ele shebechol dor vador odim aleinu dechalotenu. In every generation, our enemies rise up against us to destroy us. Hamas is that enemy in our generation. Now, Israeli solidarity driven by Hamas's actions is unprecedented right now. If anyone recalls, before October, what was the main domestic, political, and social issue that we were talking about? Judicial reform. And this judicial, I'm not going to get into the specifics, but judicial reform was as divisive of an issue probably since, many things, but particularly when Israel decided to take reparations from Germany for the Holocaust back in the 50s and 60s. It divided the country. People were out in protests every weekend after Shabbat, Saturday nights, every weekend since January. Now, no one's talking about that. Even so much so that the Israeli Supreme Court about 2 weeks ago issued a landmark ruling that has a very real impact on that reform. No one here suddenly is talking about it, and Israel is kind of on the back burner for obvious reasons. Because Israelis also realized that this attack from Hamas could have happened to any of them. But it didn't just happen to anyone. Hamas attacked the people who most believed in peace with them. The people who live, by and large, along the Gaza envelope, it's called the area in Israel just outside Gaza, they live in a thing called kibbutzim. They're essentially coming from socialist communist days, but they're socialized communities, and people there are fairly left-wing, and they believe that Israel can make peace with the Palestinians. Like I said earlier, a lot of the Gazans that were coming the last year plus were coming to these communities to work, to not so much a shop, but really for working purposes. Israel allowed more visas, more Gazans to come in. So it came to those people, and they slaughtered those people. If the Second Intifada destroyed the Israeli left and the peace camp, from which the Labor Party has never recovered, and is the outgoing labor minister or head of the party right now doesn't know what the future is for that party, October 7th destroyed any possibility for peace or a two-state solution, very much so in the near to medium term. Because after all, how do you make peace with those that raped, burned, mutilated, kidnapped, and slaughtered your civilians? And then called their parents from the phones of their victims to celebrate. Not saying I killed Israelis, but I killed Jews. While the Nazis went to great lengths to hide their atrocities, Hamas went to great lengths to broadcast theirs. So now there is one threat internally that Israel faces, and perhaps unsurprising, it's politics. Certainly politics within the war cabinet, which is there's a unity government in place right now. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, both from the same party, and the opposition leader Benny Gantz, who's he himself. All three people have served distinguished careers in the military. They formed the war cabinet. They've been making all the operational decisions about the war. But right now, given the success of Israel's military campaign, they're starting to face some very serious strategic and political questions. Well, as we get closer to Khan Yunis, they're around Khan Yunis right now, and as we get closer to the million-plus Gazan civilians that Israel requested, beseeched them to move south in the first part of the operation. Now there's over 1 million-plus Gazans in an area, a town near Rafah crossing, that's really only supposed to support about 400,000 people. The battlefront's coming closer to them. How do you engage in this sort of environment? These are now becoming political questions. And I'm afraid to say this, but it might come a situation where Israel has to decide between eliminating Hamas or retrieving as many or all the hostages possible, just the realities of the situation. And there's also a lot of political and public pressure to retrieve the hostages, and they must come home, I must say. But also, are certain members of the war cabinet right now, are they campaigning for the next political season? And also, what does the day after, if you can call it that, what does that look like? So there's different fissures that are starting to present themselves in the war cabinet and the governing coalition that could, again, make the war cabinet fall apart. And if that's the case, the war cabinet itself is a very strong sense or indication of unity domestically and for the international community. And if that falls apart, what does that mean for Israeli resolve and Israeli unity? Now, speaking the day after, this kind of gets into a conversation about U.S.-Israel relations and how the U.S. has been conducting the war, or supporting the war for the last 100-plus days. Off the bat, I have to say that Israelis, I think Israelis are more pro-American than many Americans. And they're extremely appreciative of the diplomatic, political, financial, and military support that the U.S. has given them the last 3+ months. And they're certainly appreciative at the beginning, sending aircraft carrier groups to the Mediterranean, of the president visiting during wartime. No small feat for this man. It really was a great show of support. Of course, you can only deliver a bear hug in many ways by going there to actually embrace your ally. But now, and really quickly, the one thing that Bibi asked for early was time and space. Because whenever Israel engages in a conflict, the clock starts ticking. before international pressure comes to bear, and basically, eventually the US in particular says, okay, that's enough. In 2006, Second Lebanon War, the Bush administration said basically that's enough after 34 days. In 2014, Operation Protective Edge, Israel got 51 days to conduct its operation. We are 106 days in. It's no small thing that the US has, by and large, at least the administration, by and large, has not said, okay, cease fighting. I've said a lot of other things in terms of how to fight, how to engage, which frankly I think does put Israeli soldiers at risk by limiting their operational ability to maneuver. And of course, as the civilian death toll rises, it becomes a domestic political issue for the president as well. The talk of a day after, Israelis are not thinking about a day after. Society is not thinking about that. Like I said, for them, it's still October 7th. That doesn't mean you're not going to hear in the media and the news that Bibi and other people aren't talking about it. They certainly are. They kind of driven to that based on US political pressure. But also when they talk about a day after, the US administration, they're also including the idea of the Palestinian Authority coming into control or have some role in the governance of Gaza. Well, this is the same Palestinian Authority that, per their pay-for-slay program, which financially incentivizes Palestinians to attack and kill Jews. If you attack a Jew and just wound them, Israeli, Jew, even non-Jews, you get X amount of dollars stipend a month. If you kill them, you get more. If you're sent to prison forever, for life, your family gets even more. There's legislation called the Taylor Force Act, which is supposed to put an end to this for US support. And Taylor Force was an American West Point grad who was on an MBA trip into Israel and Tel Aviv, and he was stabbed to death. So this is the organization that the administration wants to have in charge of Gaza. And I say the pay-for-slay because they just added over 600 Hamas terrorists to the pay-for-slay payroll, essentially, since October 7th. Now, expanding outward a bit to the regional environment, I've mentioned Hezbollah. They're a much more capable and powerful enemy that Israel faces. They're in Lebanon, primarily southern Lebanon. Every day, there's cross-border fire. It's been increasing the last few days, the last week. There's not a war right now with Lebanon because there's a war in Gaza. But what you're seeing, the level of activity right now on the border with Lebanon, would be classified as the third Lebanese war. And if there is going to be a full-scale engagement, we can only hope and pray it's called the last Lebanon war. But Israelis don't have any sense of security in the north right now. And in fact, I heard recently that there was a poll recently that Israelis would, if they were asked, do you want to stop the war against Hamas right now and move focus on the north with Hezbollah, most Israelis would support that. Because Hezbollah presents the strategic, even existential threat to Israel. Hamas, I mentioned, has had a few tens of thousands of rockets, many of which, as you guys are well aware, Iron Dome has been able to successfully shoot down. Hezbollah has between 150 and 200,000 rockets and missiles and guided munitions. Most of these, Iron Dome is no match for. It's just different technological systems, and these missiles, they can strike Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, elsewhere in the country. So it presents a very significant strategic threat. They have up to 100,000 fighters, many of which are battle-hardened from engaging in operations during the Syrian civil war. And Israel wants Hezbollah pushed north of the border, pushed back from the border, and this is a huge failing of the United Nations. Every 3 months or so, at the Israeli mission to the UN, we presented all the violations that Hezbollah committed in violation of a Security Council resolution, which basically said, following the 2006 Second Lebanon War, you need to be north of this river, which is about 20 miles away from the border. You're not allowed to operate south of that border, basically, that river. And Hezbollah's obviously been violating this. And so Israel, obviously, from history also does not trust the UN to have its own interests in heart. But Israel is also going to apply the lessons that's been conducting in Gaza and be able to apply them in a potential war with Hezbollah, both how to excavate and destroy terror tunnels, how to engage with an enemy that's embedded among a civilian population, how to discover and destroy rocket launching sites that's in a civilian population. And this is a part of the country, actually, I served a fair amount on. The terrain is much more difficult. It's much different than a coastal plain by Gaza. It's very mountainous, very hilly, particularly mountainous when you get to the Syrian border. So it would represent a very different kind of war, but also similar in that Israel's facing a terrorist organization embedded among a civilian population. Now, some other considerations before I close. Iran obviously is the primary threat and danger here. Hezbollah and Hamas would not be Hezbollah and Hamas without Iranian funding. And if the Biden administration says they didn't find a smoking gun that Iran ordered October 7th, and you might never find a smoking gun, but still, the funding, training, and other support that they gave to Hamas makes them extremely, culpable and complicit in the actions that day. But they represent the primary threat to Israel and the region. Iran, for its part, I don't believe wants a war between Hezbollah and Israel, largely because Hezbollah for Iran is their crown jewel proxy organization in the region. They represent the best second strike capability in the event that Israel were to strike Iran directly over its nuclear program. Because if that happens, then Iran says to Hezbollah, okay, unleash 10% of your missiles, of your rockets. That's 15,000 within hours, probably. How do you contend against that? So Iran obviously is the big threat here, and I think I saw a number today, 154 missile strikes have been conducted by Iranian proxies against American sites, contractors, et cetera, throughout Syria and Iraq, and obviously they're supporting the Houthis in the Red Sea as well. Now the Abraham Accord countries, what is their response? Well, Bahrain and the UAE have been rhetorically very supportive of Israel and recognizing the atrocity of what Hamas committed on October 7th. And Saudi Arabia actually still seems to be full steam ahead on normalization. Not discussing right now, there's other priorities for Israel for that matter, but last week at Davos, or earlier this week at Davos, the Saudi foreign minister indicated that normalization could still happen, and the Saudi ambassador to the UK said something similar about a week ago. So that's very promising. Because they also know, and I'll conclude with this, that this war is not just about Israel, nor is it going to stay in the Middle East. Israel is the Jew among the nations, and as such, it is the canary in the coal mine. As an outpost of a Western liberal world in a region devoid of liberalism, it is on the front lines against the enemies that seek our destruction as well. And none of this is theoretical academic. There are 1,200 dead Israelis and Americans, 136 hostages still held in captivity that can attest to this. Now, behind me is the Steamboat Institute's mission, Inspiring Americans to Greatness. I thought about this earlier today, how perfect of a motto of this for our time, because this may very well be the defining moment of our generation. The question now is, how are we as a people and a country going to respond? With evil ascendant across the world, will we rise to meet the moment? Now, I believe the answer is yes, because I believe in American greatness. And I believe that the United States will join Israel, as I once did, on that border, defending Western civilization from the enemies that wish to destroy us. I believe this because, just like Israel, we cannot afford to fail. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Daniel. There are just so many directions that we could take the questioning, and we unfortunately don't have 2 hours with him, although I'm sure we could certainly fill it, because there are so many aspects of this war and the implications not just for Israel, but the region and for the United States and our security. So please send in your questions, and I'll try to get as many in as possible. You come from a very unique perspective because you both served in the military, but you also saw Israel in the battles that it had in the UN. You've also dealt with the Israeli-US relationship. So I just want to start by asking a question that maybe only you can answer, and that's the political side of what you've seen. It's hard for us to understand and to look into Israeli politics. Does Bibi have the support that he needs to finish the war? And if he doesn't, what does that mean for Israel, and how might that play out? Can you speak to that?
Oh boy, starting off with a good one. I'd say the answer in short is yes, but. Okay. The yes, but is Israeli society is unanimous in its support for the need to execute the mission, the stated objectives of eliminating Hamas and finding the hostages. And this also is a good thing that Bibi formed a war cabinet to demonstrate that the government is taking this consideration very seriously and wanting to unify the country. But there's also indications, I'd say fairly strong ones, that he is starting to campaign for the day after to win re-election. Now, a lot of Israeli security and military leaders have taken responsibility, saying we will resign once current operations have subsided. We will resign for this October 7th happening on our watch. Bibi has done no such thing. And by and large, the Israeli public, I haven't seen the most recent polls, they're starting to do more polls more frequently, but by and large, the Israeli public blames him for, he's the prime minister of the last, I'm gonna get the years wrong, but for since 2008, all but 2 years, he's been prime minister, it's happened on his watch as well. So he has support now, so long as he's conducting the war in a way that does not make it seem like he's considering his political future. So I'll leave it at that.
So you've talked about the progress that the military has made, moving from the northern part of Gaza into the south. You've referenced Hezbollah and the threat from the north. What other threats, if any, does Israel face? Do you face a threat to your food supplies? Speak a little bit to the diversity of the threats that face the country today.
So Israel is susceptible to a lot of different pressure points. Even before October 7th, a main one was Israel in the last couple of years has discovered huge amounts of natural gas under the Eastern Mediterranean. And actually, earlier in spring of 2023, it was signing an agreement with Lebanon, which Lebanon does not recognize Israel, for that matter, on how to basically demarcate international zones of opportunity. And so there's different platforms out there that Israel has created, essentially Iron Dome for the sea, to try to defend these oil rig platforms. So that's one thing that's not really consideration right now, but Israel certainly could face energy supply issues. By and large, the main one is really from infiltration into the West Bank through Jordan. So Israel has two major borders, one with Egypt and the Sinai in the southwest, and obviously a large one with Jordan to the east. Peace treaties with both countries, but doesn't mean it's a warm peace. And the Jordanian border is largely porous, so there's people and materials that often come across the border that then you're in the West Bank, you're in Judea and Samaria, and Israel has a harder time tracking. Those are the main ones. With food supply and other considerations, the support from the United States is not insignificant, so there's not so much concern about that. But the last thing I'd say is we are 106 days into a war. It's unprecedented for Israeli history, except for War of Independence in terms of this length. So there's a really serious concern that Israel's economy could suffer significantly from this, because of the 350,000 reservists who showed up, almost all of them have 9-to-5 jobs. That is the main engine of Israel's economy. And at some point, they need to get back to work.
We're getting a lot of questions in from the audience about Palestinian civilians. Both, how does the war impact the ability to get them on Israel's side once the war is finished? But more immediately, why is it exactly that nations like Egypt won't step in and help, even though the United States and other nations have said, hey, we'll supply you all the aid, the tents, everything that you need? Why isn't that happening?
So when Russia invaded Ukraine, in 2014, but when invaded again, I should say, in 2022, where did Ukrainian refugees go? They went to Poland, and from there elsewhere. From the Syrian civil war, where did Syrian refugees go? To Europe and elsewhere. And every war, conflict, breeds refugees, and they all go to border countries elsewhere, except for when it comes to Israel. I mean, it's not a secret, effectively, that Arab countries do not want the Palestinians in their territory. If you look at the history of the Palestinian movement since its formation as a political entity in 1964 with the creation of the PLO, Yasser Arafat was first in Jordan, and Dr. Saad mentioned this earlier, that Fatah kidnapped his parents. The same organization Arafat led, and they tried to assassinate the king of Jordan. They were kicked out in essentially a bloody conflict. He went to Kuwait. Then he went to Libya and was kicked out. Then he went to Tunisia. He was brought back into the good fold during the Oslo Accords. So not only, and you look forward to now in the 2020s, Palestinian society, talk about the parasitic mind, they have been infused with this doctrine to hate Jews. I do mean Jews, not Israelis, but obviously it's one and the same in the community, to hate Jews, that they don't belong there, that essentially they are like the French in Algeria and could be kicked out. If you apply enough pressure and force, and over time, they will leave, they will go back. But as Golda Meir said, our secret weapons, we know where to go back to. This is kind of a roundabout way just to say that Egypt doesn't want any sort of movement or Palestinians in their territory. And it's telling that no Arab country is willing to take the Palestinians. What does that say? It speaks more about the Palestinians than the Arab countries, frankly. And when it comes to UNRWA, last comment, comes to UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency, no Arabs are stepping up to the plate under the Trump administration when they cut funding to fill in that backlog. So the Palestinians they don't have any friends in the region outside of Iran, essentially, which doesn't have the Palestinians' best interests in mind. But by and large, Egypt knows what's at risk and certainly Sisi, what's at risk if they let them in.
So when President Biden says the Palestinian Authority needs to run Gaza, and we need a two-state solution, and we need to enjoin Israel to limit civilian casualties, how is that heard both within the Israeli military, and how is that heard in the political circles that you've also been involved in within Israel?
So by and large, with this war compared to other ones, Israel and the US, and for that matter, Israel and the world, are often talking past each other. That when I say today is still October 7th, I very much mean that. And Israelis are fighting, to them, this is not a war of choice, it's a war of necessity. And they're fighting a war for their survival. In that case, it's not an elective war that they can choose to engage in or not. So in that sense, when the U.S. talks about having the Palestinian Authority involved, or anything about the Palestinians, how to conduct war to limit civilian casualties, they're doing that, understandably to some extent with American domestic considerations in mind. But that's not how Israel's thinking. And so they want to, but they will still conduct or heed to some extent the U.S.'s request because they still need U.S. political support, U.S. on their side. And Israel's Achilles heel to an extent is international public opinion. The clock started ticking on October 7th, really, well, a little bit later, but they got a little bit of window of good graces there at the time, sadly. But they do need international support. They do want it, obviously don't always get it, but they do want it, and really the consideration is that they need to conduct the war in a way, and they're doing everything they can with dropping leaflets, making phone calls, et cetera, but really to make sure the United States does not apply significant political pressure, which it hasn't yet, I'd say.
One of the themes of the summit today has been the interconnectivity of the bad guys.
Yeah.
And the way that they're cooperating and our need to disengage from that axis of disruption, so to speak. And you've spoken a lot about Iran's role here in sponsoring Hamas and Hezbollah. How have China and Russia and their support for Iran, how has that manifested in this war? Maybe speak a bit to that.
Well, let me say a quick anecdotal story. I worked for Ambassador Danny Danon, and then I worked for Ambassador Gilad Erdan, and Danny would say that the Chinese, back in the late 2010s, the Chinese would come to Israel and they say, is it Jewish? We want it. We want to buy it. They want to invest. It's been a big issue because there's a main port in Haifa that the Chinese want to invest in. There's obviously a lot of security considerations with Israel and the United States.
We had a talk to you about that.
Yeah, exactly. So the Chinese right now are not engaged directly when it comes to this conflict, and Russia as well for that matter. But this axis of resistance, really I'd call it as well, not just disruption, but resistance to the Western world is coalescing. And you really see Iran being an exporter of materials, of knowledge, et cetera. Iranian drones are being used on the battlefield in Ukraine. So that's where we're seeing it, not so much on the battlefield in Gaza just yet.
A lot of people in this audience are probably thinking, this is horrific.
Yeah.
We'd like to do something.
Yes.
What do they do?
It's a great question. There's a number of things you can do. Israel, I believe, is the future of the Middle East. And the Abraham Accords countries, they believe that as well. So what do you do if something's bullish? You invest in it. I'm not here to sell you on things for Israel, but buy Israeli. If you're at the grocery store, buy Israeli things. Buy Israeli couscous instead of other couscous, whatever. Buy things like that. Israel's economy is going to need a lot of help coming up. Israel bonds is a great way to invest in the country. Also, on the domestic front, I hear anecdotally from congressmen that they are inundated with their district offices, numbers of like 10 to 1, 20 to 1 of people saying ceasefire now versus those saying no, let Israel conduct the war it needs to. So call your representatives. Show that you support Israel and don't call for a ceasefire, call for whatever the Israeli government is calling for at the time. Certainly your prayers are very helpful, obviously, as well. And finally, I'd say is if you have any Jewish friends or Israeli friends, reach out to them. Ask them how they're doing. Just say you're here, you're thinking about them. It goes a long way. Because one thing the last 3 months have revealed, and kind of a story of this conference, is the masks are off. We know who our true friends or enemies are. And silence when it comes to supporting the Jewish people abroad and here has been deafening. So pick up the phone.
And do you have a view or a role in politics in Israel in the future, Daniel?
Oh, no, I'm American. I have my future here, career here. Certainly.
I think the Israeli ambassador to the United States was from Miami, so
yeah.
just because you were born in Chicago,
right.
Doesn't
Ron
really
Dermer,
matter,
yes,
right?
Yes, he was
yeah.
Ron Dermer. No, I plan to be here. I live in the D.C. area, so I plan to be helping advocate for Israel because it's not just a story about Israel. And I started saying this, I hope I conclude with this. It's a story about the West as Professor Saad said, they first come for the Saturday people, then they come for the Sunday people. And the reasons I serve is because Israel is so intertwined with the American story. They modeled their Declaration of Independence on our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution in many ways, at least the ideas and the ethos that came out of that. So very much, Israel wants America to be strong, and just like we should want Israel to be strong as well.
Great. Well, we'll end there. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Mary.
Please join me in thanking Daniel. Thank you.